Well, good day, everyone. Welcome to this session on load shedding over the next 3 years. Some ideas from the CSIR Energy Center on the expected magnitude, as well as some possible mitigation to avert a very constrained power system over the next 3 to 5 years in South Africa. The basis for this research is really some research that we did at the end of last year and beginning of this year. We're actually also busy updating it, and we'll talk to that during the session. But it really tried to get an understanding of the supply-demand balance and the electricity crisis that we are in. I'm Dr. Jarrad Wright. I'm a principal researcher in the CSIR Energy Center, and my co-author on this work is Joanne Calitz. We will be presenting this work together today, and we do hope that you enjoy it. Let's get going. So why we made this contribution was fourfold. Our independence as a research institution. We feel like we are an independent scientific research institution and council with no vested interest in particular outcomes, so we can provide that level of independence to a range of stakeholders in the industry. Transparency, so historically as well as more recently, we have developed and collated the necessary data, the analytics, and the modeling frameworks that supports the work that we do, whilst the work that we do is also published and put into the public domain for all stakeholders to scrutinize and assess and hopefully add value to their enterprises and businesses. Thirdly, our experience and expertise. We have a range of capabilities within the Energy Center at CSIR. We're highly proficient and competent in this particular domain, which is long-range energy planning, and specifically the outcomes from this, we would then hope. Let me pause. Our experience and expertise. CSIR is highly proficient and competent in this domain with respected capabilities, all the way from system operations to energy planning to grid planning. We're well positioned to undertake this suite of analysis as we feel like we are a trusted, independent public institution. And then finally, around expedience, the work that we did was in a very short time domain. The research was undertaken in the order of 2 months towards the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020. As I was mentioning, we will also provide some idea of updates to the work in the next few slides. So what are we addressing in this contribution? Well, we tried to answer 3 fundamental questions. Over the next 3 to 5 years, are we in a crisis right now? How long will load shedding last? And what options are available to solve the electricity crisis that we're in? So what we address is assessing whether we are indeed in a crisis. Unfortunately, what we do find is that indeed we are. And it's not just CSIR or ourselves that are saying this. There are many that have said this, including President in the State of the Nation at the beginning of 2020. We will then also present 2 scenarios to get an understanding of the expected intensity as well as duration of load shedding in the coming years. And then, of course, what we would like to answer in the end is not just stop there and identify the problem, but to propose some feasible solutions and options to alleviate the crisis, and obviously testing their impact to see how much they can help. So the burning platform that we're on, we had the worst year of load shedding in 2019, 1,352 gigawatt hours, 530 hours throughout the year where we did experience load shedding. We had up to stage 6 towards the end of the year, but now in 2020 it actually was a little bit worse already in the first half of the year, and I'll show that as well before my co-author then takes you through some of the research findings. Secondly, we also expect for the load shedding to continue for at least the next 2 to 3 years. This is a function of, and it depends on a range of key actions and decisions that need to be taken. The reduced demand that we've seen in 2020 as a result of the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown has provided some space, but only briefly, as demand really shot straight back up to where it was before. The system is still highly constrained. So as a result of this, an urgent response is necessary to ensure short-term adequacy and, of course, set ourselves up for a successful decade in the 2020s. That's even more urgent now as we plan for post-COVID-19 economic recovery and as that recovery starts to take shape. The key items that we want to highlight as part of this research were some systemic changes in critical input assumptions around the Eskom fleet performance, the energy availability factor, or EAF, as well as the demand forecast. This updated understanding we'll talk you through, as this then gives a feel for the capacity as well as energy gap that we could be experiencing relative to what is already in the public domain as part of official government policy, that is the Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP 2019. So as you'll see, this happened This is a plot from left to right. You'll see from about the end of March, where we went into a national lockdown as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. You'll see the blue curve is the actuals. The brown curve is the expected or the forecast that came from Eskom at the beginning of the year, whilst the areas underneath that is the deviations between the two across the various levels. So from level 5 to level 4 to level 3, level 2, and then level 1. As you can see, these significant deviations resulted in some system operations challenges, but it did indeed assist. That lower demand provides additional space for the supply side and for maintenance to be done. And we'll try and talk through that as well in terms of the maintenance that was done during the weeks of 2020 when we were in level 5 and level 4 of the lockdown. If we just zoom in then specifically on that deviation, up to 11 gigawatts and under level 5 at least, and up to 8.5 gigawatts under level 4 was what we started to see in terms of the deviation in the maximum demand. Now remember, the South African power system is about a 32 to 34 gigawatt peaking system, so there is a significant impact on the peak demand during those first 5 weeks, and then during the next weeks under level 4, there's still a significant deviation of up to 8.5 gigawatts or 8,500 megawatts. Unfortunately for the power system, but fortunately for the economy, the demand did return, businesses reopened, the mines reopened, refineries reopened, and you start to see that in the yellow, the blue, and the green, so under level 3, level 2, and level 1 of the lockdown, that the demand really returned back towards, you could call, a new normal, but the deviations are then much smaller during those periods and within error tolerances that you could expect. So just to zoom in specifically on level 5, you'll see those large deviations that I was talking to. No real seasonal or systemic daily pattern change as yet under level 5, but as I was talking to, the demand dropped from the 31.2 gigawatts down to 27.4 gigawatts, whilst the minimum demand, or the minimum demand that the country experienced, was down to 13.8 gigawatts, which provides a lot of challenges for the coal fleet, as it's not necessarily flexible and can't go down to very low levels. And there was some level of curtailment that was actually undertaken by the system operator as a result of this, of the renewables fleet. Under level 4, a bit more of a pattern started to emerge, where you'll see when you look at the deviation at the bottom of this graphic, you see that during the weeks, there's really a large deviation in the mornings. It seems like that was really as a result of people getting up a lot later, not necessarily going into the office, and remote working as a result. So you see those spikes during the weeks, but then on the weekends that starts to move away, and you really just have that sort of base demand difference in under level 4. Then under level 3, you'll see it's not as easy to see, but in the yellow there, the deviations are really very, very small compared to level 5 and level 4. But the interesting part here was that the demand returned so much so that on the 10th to the 16th of July, we returned to load shedding to stage 2. And then on the 13th and 14th of August, as highlighted there, we also had further level of load shedding in the order of stage 2 and stage 3. This was one of the longest lockdown levels in the order of 80 days. And during that period, as you'll see, the brief reprieve as a result of the reduced demand really was taken away as businesses started to reopen and the economy started to get back to work. Under level 2, similarly, a very small level of deviation between the actuals versus forecasted. But you'll see those blue highlighted areas where load shedding did occur. You start to see that that's really when the system was most constrained relative to expectations, particularly during peak demand periods and high demand periods during the day. And you'll also see that come through as we start to show some forecasts of the research that we did in the next 3 to 5 years as to when during the day we should expect the highest levels of constraints on the system. And then this is under level 1, still ongoing. The data thus far is up to the end of October, as you can see. But I think most importantly, you see the deviations are really quite minimal. We're back to normal again under level 1, and hopefully a less constrained power system. But as you will see in terms of some of the research that we have done, the unfortunate reality is that if the demand does continue to grow, and we would hope continues to grow as a result of the economy recovering, we are likely to see a significantly constrained power system. Again, we will try to highlight some of the remedies around this, but it does depend on a lot of actors, a lot of institutions, and a lot of implementation across various parts of the industry. So this is just quickly to highlight in 2020 when the load shedding occurred and how constrained the power system was. During January, February, and March, you'll see it's not just necessarily in the evening peak or in the morning peak. It was actually load shedding throughout the days, mostly during weekdays, but load shedding throughout the days. And then during some more intense periods in March, you had up to stage 3 and stage 4 for most of the days for an extended period of 3 to 4 weeks. In the second half of the year now, in July, August, and September, we had stage 2 as well as stage 3, and then eventually stage 4 in September for a brief period, but also mostly during the day, during those high demand periods. So not just during evening peak, not just during morning peak, but mostly during the day when there is very high levels of demand on the power system. So you don't necessarily have enough energy. It's not necessarily about how much capacity you have, it's about how much energy you have in the power system. So a quick summary, 2020 indeed was the most intensive load shedding year that we have seen thus far, based on the data that we do have in the public domain. 90% of which actually occurred within the first 12 weeks. Thereafter, as I was talking now, we did push past 2019 levels in July already, and we're now at 1,734 gigawatt hours versus the 1,352 in 2019. So this is a weekly plot of the residual demand for the year. The dark blue is what we have seen on a weekly basis in the order of 3,000 to 4,500 gigawatt hours per week of demand across the country. The gray area, though, is the deviation. So you can see as the lockdown started in that week 13, week 12, week 13 of the year, you really see significant deviations in the expected weekly energy demand in the order of a reduction of 20% for an extended period of 2 to 3 weeks. That did recover, though, as you see, as we went into winter. A lot of cold days, a lot of high demand, and also, of course, industry returning. And you see that then those deviations get smaller and smaller through the year, all the way up to week 42, of which the data is now available. And you see that the deviations are now quite small, still a bit lower than expectations from the beginning of the year, but really very close to what the forecast was at the beginning of the year. A 14 terawatt hour, or about 6.3% reduction in energy demand is expected for 2020. That is residual energy demand. So in terms of what we did at CSIR, system adequacy has been highlighted by many institutions. We're just showing two here, two seminal pieces of work that are periodically published. One is the Integrated Resource Plan 2019, the other of which is the Medium-Term System Adequacy Outlook, also published in 2019. That's also published annually. But in both of these documents, there was a highlighting of the short-term supply gap between 2019 and 2022 in the IRP, and then also a highlighting of the gap if the Eskom fleet EAF fell below 72%. If you keep that number in mind, you'll start to see why that becomes important, because the EAF is indeed below that level, and hence we have been experiencing load shedding and will be expected to see load shedding in the coming years, unfortunately. So this is the trend, long-term trend, all the way back to 2000 up to 2019 in terms of actuals, and then some forecasts towards 2030. As you'll see, the decline in the EAF of the Eskom fleet down to below 70%. The year to date is just about 67%. Those are the actuals year to date. In terms of some forecasts, previous versions of the IRP in the IRP 2018 is the red curve, black curve, and green curve there with the dashed curve. You'll see that the recovery at that stage was expected to head towards 80% in terms of a mid scenario, but still above 70% even in a low scenario. As you'll see there, though, in the black curve, the black dotted curve, the forecast was in the IRP 2019 for the EAF to recover all the way up to 75.5 within the space of 4 years by 2023-24. The unfortunate reality being that that hasn't necessarily happened. And you'll see the medium-term system adequacy outlook, which perhaps has more updated information within it, starts to show perhaps something that is closer to the reality, which is the green curve, the blue curve, and that orange curve in terms of a range of the EAF. The green curve is really an expectation as to when a low EAF expectation for the medium-term system adequacy outlook, whereas the orange curve is then a high expectation for different levels of minimum emission standards compliance. So this is now also EAF for the year to date, 66% that I was talking to. In 2019, it was 66.9%. The year before that, just below 72. So you'll see the trend indeed is on a declining trend. It's very worrying. Eskom are trying to improve this, but the reality on the ground is something different. And this really, therefore, needs to be highlighted to make sure that we make the requisite investments in the power system to minimize the level of load shedding or have no load shedding at all over the next 3 to 5 years. So in terms of the breakdown of that EAF number, we just plotted this here on a weekly basis for 2020. So OCLF is other capability loss factor, UCLF is unplanned capability loss factor, and PCLF is the planned capability loss factor. So the EAF is then the subtraction of all of those relative to that 100% line. As you can see, during those first few weeks of the lockdown, week 12, 13, 14, Eskom did take some opportunistic maintenance and did maintenance, so they increased that orange component of the graphic there, the planned outages. Unfortunately, the unplanned outages, as they are by definition, are unplanned, and they have still remained quite high, which means that for the year, that blue curve that you see is really the average that we're talking to, around that 66%. It has to be at 70% or higher, or at least according to the medium-term system adequacy outlook, 72% or higher, in order to ensure that there's no supply-demand gap that we will be experiencing. So I will stop there for today and hand over to my colleague, Joanne, to then walk you through some of the research and the forward-looking components of what we undertook.
Okay, now that Jarrad's given a good overview of the current landscape, I will take you through the next 5 years. So in order to assess what kind of shortages we can expect in future, we had to do some scenario analysis. So the two cases that we looked at are shown in dark blue in this graph. So the IRP 2019 in the top right quadrant. This scenario assumes a relatively high demand forecast along with a relatively good EAF, so an EAF that recovers up to 74%. The alternative scenario that we looked at, we named the updated scenario, and we developed this around December 2019, so this was before the pandemic. Here we looked at a lower demand forecast, but also a lower EAF, so an EAF that is declining over time. So these are the two input assumptions that we used, the EAF on the left. The top black line is the IRP assumption, and the bottom line comes from the medium-term system adequacy outlook. The graph on the right, the top forecast, top line is the higher demand forecast, and the bottom line is based on the medium-term system adequacy outlook as well. So the two top dark lines go together in the one scenario, and the two bottom lines together in the other scenario. So coming to the expected shortages. So here we are looking at the IRP scenario. So if you can remember, a relatively high demand forecast, but also a relatively good EAF. So here we can expect capacity shortages over the next few years. The capacity shortages are shown on the left. This refers to the magnitude of an outage in a given hour. And the graph on the right, in terms of energy shortage, refers to the duration and severity of the outage. So as you can see, 2019 is kind of a reference point in the energy shortage graph, which we are familiar with, and we expect less load shedding in 2020, 2021, and 2022 with these input assumptions. Beyond 2022, there's new capacity coming online in terms of the IRP 2019, so this does continue to alleviate the power system. If we have a look at what those shortages look like on an hourly basis, this graph shows on the top curves are showing the demand profile of the country, so the national energy demand in summer and winter. The profile is lower in the evening and increases in the morning peak, pretty much flat in the middle of the day, and increases again in the evening. The graphs at the bottom are showing the profile of the outages that we expect in this IRP scenario. And as you can see in some of the earlier years, the outages are expected to take place all day, so it's sort of a 24/7 profile. And this is indicative of an energy shortage. Over time, this is expected to change to more of a capacity issue, where the outages are in the morning and the evenings. So what does this look like in a little bit more detail of the power system supply stack? Here we're showing two simulated weeks for this IRP scenario. We obviously modeled every single hour of all the years, but that's a bit difficult to show. So here we are showing two drastically different EAF weeks. The EAF that we report annually actually does change on a daily basis and a weekly basis, and the average over the year is what we typically report on. But in a week where we have a poor EAF, the 64% in week 1, you can see here we have some unserved energy, so that's the white area, just under the black line, and the diesel generators, which are shown in the cream color, are working really hard to try and meet load. In the second week, this is a much less constrained week where the EAF is performing quite well. Now if we go to the alternative scenario, a little bit lower demand forecast, but a much worse EAF. So here you can see the capacity and the energy shortages are much more profound than the previous scenario. The energy shortages are expected to be worse in 2020 than 2019, and this is expected to grow to 2022, and after that, new capacity comes online according to the IRP. So this is obviously a much worse situation and a worse outlook for the country. Now, how do those outages look on an hourly basis? Here, the graphs are in the same format as before, but now we can see that the outages are more of an energy shortage occurring all throughout the day in most of the years. Again, we simulate the same 2 weeks. Now we have a much lower EAF. So here we can see a lot more load shedding occurring, so a lot more areas, white shaded areas in this graph, and the diesel generators are working harder in both weeks. The energy shortages are also throughout the day, so you can see the shaded areas, white shaded areas are occurring morning, evening, and middle of the day. So this was the outlook that we assessed earlier this year, and of course since then we have had the pandemic, and as Jarrad showed, the demand in 2020 has dropped significantly, around 6%, and the question really is, how does this outlook change if the demand doesn't pick up in future? So we've plotted here a graph of the demand reduction that we could possibly see, so the orange line in this graph, and the outlook in this situation we haven't published yet, but we will be publishing soon. But we can say already preliminary results are showing that even with the lower demand forecast, we still expect load shedding within the next 3 years. So now the question is, what can we do about it? We set a list of criteria of thinking about the options that we have. So obviously if the crisis is here and now, we need to find supply options or demand side options or storage that can be deployed relatively quickly, delivered within 1 to 2 years or even faster. So obviously for that to happen, we can't have extensive procurement processes, so the legislation needs to be quite simple to ensure shorter lead times. We're looking for options that can meet both capacity and energy shortages. As we've shown, that is an issue in most of the earlier years, as well as the later years. And then contracting of this capacity could be short-term, 1 to 3 years, but there's no reason why it couldn't be longer-term as well if these options are aligned with the long-term vision of the country. So lastly, something that's not really spoken about often, but of course, none of these options should require any extensive network expansions, because that would delay the process. So we've tried to summarize three steps of what we can do to try and alleviate the power system. These steps work together interchangeably, and if one is delayed or less than expected, the others obviously need to scale up. So if we just look at the first option, step 1, customer response at scale. So what do we mean by this? We really mean that end users of power begin to supplement their own supply. So this could be any end user, starting from residential customers to commercial customers, industrial customers, all the way to large energy users. And of course, the scale at which this can be deployed across the country is more significant if many of the larger users do that. And to enable this to deploy faster, obviously we do need legislation in place to make this easier for customers. Another option that we highlighted in step 1 as well is an increase in capacity from the renewable IPPs that are currently online. So there is capacity there that could be unlocked if the PPAs that are in place are edited. The second step really is the DMRE, Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, Risk Mitigation Program. This is already currently running, but what we really want to highlight is that this needs to be expedited, and this capacity needs to come online as quickly as possible. So there's currently a request for proposals for 2,000 megawatts, and this is probably only going to come online in 2022, so that would not alleviate the power system this year or next year. Lastly, implementation of policy in the form of the capacity that is assigned in the IRP 2019. This capacity was originally planned to come online in 2022, and we already foresee that this will be a challenge given that we are at the end of 2020 and the process that needs to be followed has not begun yet. So this also needs to be expedited, but will not help us in the immediate 2-year time frame. So we just wanted to show again what happens if we do actually implement step 1 and step 2 on the previous curves that we showed. Step 3 we assume was always implemented in our modeling results. So as you can see here, the power system becomes less and less constrained as you implement additional steps or additional capacity in the system. The same thing for the updated scenario, where we previously had full days of unserved energy. Now with step 1 we only have unserved energy in the evening peaks, and with step 2 significantly less unserved energy in the system. So again, just to highlight the actions that need to be taken for the 3 steps and the impact that they are likely to have. For step 1, we need an immediate focus on customer response at scale. And this needs to be enabled through regulations, such as increasing the licensing cap on what you can install on your premises, for example. There could also be incentive programs and awareness campaigns so that people understand what they can do. And this is the only option out of the 3 that would help alleviate the power system right now. So this is the short-term option. It can help us this year already and next year as well. The other 2 options, like I've said previously, need to be accelerated. So the processes that are in place need to run as quickly as possible so that we can get that capacity online. But that is only expected 2022 and beyond. So just to summarize our analysis, of course, there are 2 implicit assumptions that we haven't highlighted as steps, but these are important and these do need to happen. So the first one is that Eskom does need to ensure that the capacity that needs to come online in form of Medupi and Kusile and the signing of the existing IPPs, that needs to happen and be delivered on time. And secondly, if there can be any recovery in the EAF in the immediate or short term, this would help alleviate the power system. This obviously can't come at exorbitant cost if there are alternative options, so that also needs to be analysed and weighed against the advantages. Then of course the 3 steps that we've highlighted, customer response at scale and accelerating the 2 procurement programs. And then lastly, just to highlight again, this analysis is going to be updated soon. The CSIR will publish some updated results given what we think the demand forecast will do post the COVID pandemic, and also what sort of delays we expect on the new build programs. So that summarizes the analysis that we've done. We do encourage you to please download the presentation, and we've added in an extra slide with a link to a survey that we would please like you to answer. It's just a quick survey on crowdfunding of energy research at the CSIR, and we would appreciate your opinions on this. Thank you. Can you describe the DMRE risk mitigation program, where we are currently and what information there is available to date?
Yeah, so the DMRE risk mitigation program was designed by the DMRE very recently, actually the Independent Power Producers Office, the IPP office. And the intention was to procure 2,000 megawatts of capacity for a very specific delivery period from June 2022 for 20 years, with a minimum offtake or what's called a capacity factor of 50% for the year. Also on a daily basis, there is only a requirement for the energy to be produced between 5 and 9:30. For the rest of the hours, there's no capacity that will be provided to the grid. Generally speaking, the bids will be evaluated on price, as well as socioeconomic development and enterprise development. Hopefully there will be some positive outcomes from it. From a systems perspective, we've done some analysis to indicate perhaps what type of capacity is needed, and that's what our research was showing. The DMRE risk mitigation program, of course, has a role to play in that as well. We are a little bit concerned, of course, as you know, around the delivery timeframe, June 2022. That's not very far away. And as you know, the RFP, or request for proposals, is actually only in the public domain now, of which it is closing on the 24th of November. So not a lot of time available.
What do you think the demand expectation will be going forward, given our 6% drop this year?
Yeah, so it's a difficult one to answer. We don't have many crystal balls at the moment, but we've tried to assess what this may look like on the basis of what actually has happened in 2020 thus far. In the research that we showed the reduction during level 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 of the lockdown. But beyond that, into 21, 22, and beyond that, we've started to just try and map that onto some previous forecasts as to the growth thereafter. The interesting part of this is that even with a lower demand forecast or demand forecast expectation, the system is still expected to be constrained, perhaps a little bit less than what we indicated in what we've published already. But some of our upcoming results, hopefully in the public domain very soon, will start to clarify that with an updated demand forecast as well as updated information on the supply side.
Now, a lot of people have been talking about what role municipalities can play in this energy crisis. Do we have any specific work going on, and what are they expected to do and how can they help?
So most definitely, I think municipalities have a role to play, either via direct procurement of capacity by themselves, via IPPs, very similar to the national program, just at a municipal level, or via incentivizing the programs for their own customers to start to invest in their own capacity. So that's from the residential sector to the commercial sector to light industrial as well as heavy industrial sectors, as well as mining. In the medium to long term, of course, the municipal business model and the way in which previously municipalities have bought electricity from Eskom and on-sold to customers is being turned on its head as a result of what I was just mentioning now. A lot of self-supply options, smaller supply technologies that are efficient, also very cost competitive relative to grid-based electricity. But having said that, it is also important to understand, and that's what we are also trying to understand at CSIR, what role municipalities can play more generally and what that business model can look like, but also not necessarily just defecting from the grid completely, but using the grid when it's valuable and self-supplying yourself when it's valuable. And these offsets and these balances are always needing to be found. It's not a 1 or a 0.
I think that's an important point as well with our customer response at scale. We do believe that the grid has a huge role to play going forward. Large energy intensive users will probably never go off grid, and there's always a balance to be found there.
I mean, I guess when you were talking to that one slide where you're talking to the updates that you're doing and the new simulation runs that you're undertaking as a result of the impact of COVID and some of the other supply side delays, Medupi Kusile, the renewables program. What updates will you be assessing in that, and what updates should people be expecting in the coming weeks and months?
So I think for the first time, a lot has really changed in a short time span since we did the analysis, specifically on the demand forecast. So we really do need to have an updated view of how constrained our system will be if we update the demand. The EAF, we seem to be tracking the lower line, unfortunately. So the year-to-date EAF is around 66%, and that may go down a bit towards the end of the year. As you know, the summer months are very constrained for Eskom, and the EAF could be around 65 for the end of the year. So we are still tracking that lower EAF line, unfortunately. Then in terms of capacity that's coming online in future, the Medupi and Kusile plants, obviously they do need to be commissioned soon. I think they are mostly on track according to the previous presentation that the Eskom CEO made about 2 weeks ago. The new capacity in terms of the emergency procurement program, however, and the IRP capacity is probably delayed. So this is something we didn't assess in our analysis. We assumed that the capacity would be on time, and obviously the outages are expected to be or to carry on longer if the new capacity is delayed.
I'm glad you answered that question. I was going to ask that next. So it is interesting to hear those updates on the supply side. And I suppose at the end of the day, it's about getting that capacity online reliably, fixing the design defects at Medupi and Kusile, and making sure that we then can get the energy out of very capex-intensive projects for the next however many years they are going to be operating in the South African power system. I suppose we could just close out on what could you and I and households and the individual do to help alleviate the power crisis? And what could people do to make their lives easier during what we would expect to be quite difficult times over the next few years in terms of electricity supply-demand balance?
So I think as just a general citizen in our households, there are a few things that we can do. I know I showed that the outages are expected all day 24/7, but the peak periods are still a concern and they are still very difficult for our system to handle. So just shifting load into off-peak periods is an easy change that everyone can make. Don't switch your dishwasher on in the evening peak, for example. Try and time those things. And for businesses and workplaces, having the air cons running all day, every day, set the setting to a lower temperature, 24 degrees Celsius, for example, will still cool the room, and that can also provide a lot more energy efficient cooling. So energy efficiency, obviously, buying appliances that have a better efficiency rating can help to reduce demand going forward. And then obviously just using alternative supply sources. You could supplement your supply with solar PV, obviously. This is becoming a bit of an expensive option. But just changing your cooking, for example, from electricity to having more fires, for example, this can also alleviate your electricity demand. So there are a few things that we can do as citizens.
And I imagine a switch to using gas, for example, for cooking could be a good option for some. It's obviously an affordability issue at the end of the day, but it is up to ways in which we can be clever and finance these types of investments that households would like to make. Perhaps putting it into existing financial packages like their mortgages to make sure that then it is sustainable in the long term. And it is not just an investment, at least my understanding. It's not just an investment for now, it's an investment for the long term. So even if you are planning to stay in that house or moving to a different house or home in the future, it adds value to that asset. And that obviously then adds wealth to your family.
Indeed. And just on that topic, I do think that we will be publishing soon a brochure for the public just to help them out on what they can do, what different options we have. We are now open for questions.